I'd like to welcome you all to number 130 of our Let's Talk About sessions today on Piemonte's white wines. I'd like to extend a welcome to those of our members that are joining for the first time and also to our non-members. There's a number of new faces here. It's a pleasure to have you here. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK and today has around 270 members, including wine writers, educators and broadcasters and other professional communicators. The membership is now global, with a 50-50 split between the UK and overseas. Our website is a great source of information about the Circle, and there's also details there for you about how you can join online. I'd now like to hand over to Meg Maker, our chair, who will introduce our speaker, David Way. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Welcome, everyone. Really pleased to see so many different faces from all over the world actually joining us today. So David Way, I met him for the first time in person in July. We happened to bump into each other at Berry Brothers in Rudd right before a summer luncheon for the Circle, right across the street at 67 Pall Mall. David is a Circle member and he specializes in the wines of Italy. He publishes articles on his own website, which is winefriend.org, and more recently in Decanter, where his article on today's topic was published first. David also works as a senior researcher on the WSET Level 4 Diploma of Wines textbooks. And in 2023, he published The Wines of Piemonte with Académie de Vin Library. This was the first book to treat the entire region of Piemonte with the same depth that's usually reserved just for the famous zones of Barolo and Barbaresco. David's current project is to write an annual report on the wines of northern Piemonte, and he actually joins us today from Gattinara, where he's just begun a 10-day excursion to try to fulfill that mission. The first edition of that is going to be released in March of 2026. So please join me in welcoming David Way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. Here we go. Right, can people see that?
Yes, perfect, David. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, super. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, I'm pleased to be talking to you literally from Gattinara, which is not famous for white wine. But of course, in northern Piemonte, they also grow Erba Luce, which is part of the presentation I'm going to make today. So the presentation is, as I say, based on a piece I did last year for Decanter called Piemonte's White Wines, an Accelerating Trend. And in the pictures you can see on the screen, on the left is in Roero, very steep sandy vineyard with Arnese in it, of course. And in the middle you have Valtamassa, the pioneer of Timorasso, who I'm sure many of you will know about. And then on the right is Nascetta, which is a lovely white grape variety, which is grown in Novello in the Barolo area. So there's we're going to do this this presentation comes in two parts. So first of all, I'm going to look at the world trend in wine production for black and white grape varieties, or actually technically red and white wine, in order to put the Piemontese situation into a global perspective. Then I'm going to look at black versus white varieties by hectares of vineyard in Piemonte. Then we're going to look at, in a little bit more detail, at the trend between 2008 and 2025. Why those dates? Because from 2008, if you're a very persistent researcher, you can get onto the Regione Piemonte's official website and see the actual planting of individual grape variety for all of the 60 or so grape varieties that are planted in Piemonte. And then you can follow the whole data series through until 2025. So it's a remarkable chance to look with real accuracy at what's going on, because I'll just make the general point now. Wine production obviously changes from year to year, depending on the weather, depending on the choice of producers, and many other factors. But actually, the number of hectares in the ground show long-term trends, because as you all know, planting a vineyard is not a small endeavor, and you only do it if you think there is a 10 to 20 to 30 year future for that vineyard. So I think this is a really important metric. Then we're going to look at the trend within the white varieties, which varieties are doing well, And then finally, we're going to look at 6 top white varieties. So without further ado, let's move on. So this is OIV data for the production of wine. This is hectoliters of, sorry, this is based on hectoliters of wine. And what it shows is the difference between the beginning of this century. So I've averaged the years 2000 through to 2004 to show that 47.6% of wine was red in production in that period, and 45%, nearly 46%, was white, and then nearly 7% was rosé. By 2021, which is the latest data I could find, that situation had changed so that what had been 47.6% red has become 42.6% red. And equally, what was 45.6 white has increased to 49.3. So you can see there that white wine in general in the world was being made more in those decades. And we all know that people are drinking more white wine than they did in the past, and red is suffering. The rosé figures are interesting, but we haven't really got time to go into them. I was surprised they hadn't grown more, but that's obviously another story. So moving on to Piemonte as a red wine region. I'm starting with this slide simply to ask the question, why do we think of Piemonte as a red wine region? And obviously the first reason is Nebbiolo, undoubtedly the finest grape variety in the region. And because it's prestigious, valuable, and sought after around the world, we immediately think, well, all of Piemonte is like that. Of course, that's not the case at all. It also has Barbera and Dolcetto. So you have 3 important local red wines, and that's basically why we think of Piemonte as a red wine region. However, we tend to simply forget that Piemonte also grows a large amount of Moscato, a large amount of Cortese, and a very good amount of Arneis. So really, this is partly a matter of perception that we think of Piemonte as a red wine region. There always has been a lot of white grapes and a lot of white wine as well. So if we move on then to see what has changed between 2008 and 2025, and again, these are percentages. The first thing to say is that the total vineyard area in Piemonte is exactly the same as it was in 2008, which is quite interesting in its own right, because the world area has shrunk by 6% in that time. And you know that people are having to pull up vineyards in many places. So it's interesting that Piemonte has bucked that trend, which shows how strong it is in overall situation. However, there's been a really fascinating shift, which I don't think has ever been noticed before. And that is, it has gone from being 67% black grapes to 60% black grapes in only 17 years. And equally, it's gone from 33% white to 40% white. These are hectares in the ground, remember, again, in only 17 years. So it is a really remarkably swift change that has happened in those years when we have the data available, publicly available. That's just a little slide to show that this has been going on pretty evenly through those years. We don't really need to dwell on this slide, so let's move on, as time is short. So let's now review Piemonte as a whole. What were the 10 top varieties in 2025 in terms of hectares in the ground? And you can see that Barbera, Moscato, and Nebbiolo are the 3 big varieties. And very interestingly, Moscato and Barbera Moscato are virtually identical now. Now that's a situation that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Barbera would have been way ahead than Moscato, and the underlying reasons for that are that there simply isn't the market for inexpensive or relatively inexpensive wine from Piemonte. The costs are just too high in this region. And secondly, there's no agricultural workforce drinking vast amounts of cheap Barbera any longer. And thirdly, Flavescenza dorata, so vine yellows, is a real problem for Barbera. So people are losing Barbera naturally anyway, whereas Moscatos continue to grow. The other thing to notice about this slide is that most of these grape varieties are native grape varieties. So Barbera, Nebbiolo, Dolcetto, Cortese, Arnese, Bracchetto, and Grignolino are all native to the region. We can discuss whether Moscato is native or not, because we don't really know where Moscato came from. But what is the case is that there is vastly more Moscato in Piemonte than anywhere else in the world. So it's sort of native by adoption. So you can see that basically this is I'm delighted to say, primarily a region of native grape varieties. And you can see there that the top four grape varieties, three are red or three are black grapes. And therefore that's what, so we're quite right in a sense to think of Piemonte as a red wine producing region. Okay, this slide shows the difference in terms of numbers of hectares. So now this is not percentages, this is absolute numbers of hectares between 2008 and 2025. And you can see here that Barbera has dropped dramatically, even in these 17 years. And it will have dropped even, if I had data from way back when, it would have been even more dramatic. But it's lost nearly 4,000 hectares in just 17 years and has dropped by a quarter. It shows a really dramatic change here. And okay, there's still plenty of Barbera. I think it's even sadder that Dolcetto has really suffered. You can see that it's lost 2,600 hectares, 45% in 17 years. And that's principally because most Dolcetto in the Langhe has been dug up and replaced with Nebbiolo. So yeah, there we go. But the positive story, as it were, is this incredible increase in the planting of Nebbiolo in these 17 years, plus 3,500 hectares, plus 85%. And I mean, there are two pretty obvious reasons for that. One is that climate warming, has meant that Nebbiolo will grow in a lot of places that it wouldn't have ripened fully in the past. So those of you who follow the wine press might have seen that they even had a debate in Barolo. They even had a proposition that you'd be allowed to plant Nebbiolo for Barolo on north-facing slopes. Quite incredible. It would have been inconceivable 25 years ago because the grapes would never have ripened. It was defeated, but even so, the very fact that they were talking about it tells you that there is a huge demand for land for Nebbiolo. And the other reason is absolutely obvious as well. You get so much more for your Nebbiolo grapes than for any other grape. And therefore, of course, the economic imperative is to grow more and more Nebbiolo. So that's what's happened in the broad picture. So if we move on then to the heart of this topic, which is the top white varieties in Piemonte, and the yellow block is how many white grapes there were, hectares of white grapes in 2008. The orange one is the 2025 figure. And you can see here, the main point of this slide is to show how massive Moscato is. So you can see that Moscato is 4 times as big as any other grape variety. What happens there makes an enormous difference. The other interesting thing about this slide is that every single grape variety of the top 10 white grape varieties in 2025 has grown in the last 17 years. Every single one has increased. We'll see that some have increased much more than others, but you can see here why you've got this situation where they have all increased. Okay, if we move on then to which grape varieties have been particularly popular. And this is the increase in number of hectares, not the absolute number. So the previous slide was the absolute number of hectares. This is the increase in hectares in the years between 2008 and 2025. And you can see that the biggest winner, and I was surprised by this, is Arnese, which has added 774 hectares in that period. Most of that is in Roero. A little bit is in the Langhe, other parts of Piemonte, but mostly in Roero. So that's the biggest grower. Second biggest is Moscato, but then remember, there was a vast amount of Moscato anyway, so this is not a huge percentage increase, but it is a lot of hectares nonetheless. And then, totally unsurprisingly, the super fashionable Timorasso has put on nearly 500 hectares in this period, and followed by Chardonnay. The footnote to the Chardonnay is that about half of that is for sparkling wine, for traditional method sparkling wine. So one of the other big new features of the Piedmontese situation is the denomination Alta Langa, which is traditional method sparkling wine made with Pinot Noir and/or Chardonnay. And a lot of this Chardonnay goes into still wine, but the other half will go into sparkling wine. Then you've got decent increases for the others: Cortese, Erboluccia, Viognier, Sauvignon, Nascetta, and Favorita. Notice again that most of these are native grape varieties, which I think is great. So there you can see that the big winner was Arneis. I did put the percentages at the bottom of the page. Some of them are meaningful and some of them are not. So Arneis has increased by 100%. Timorasso has increased by over 1,000%, but that's because there was so little of it back in 2008. And the only one to outperform it is Viognier, which has put on a cool 26,000%. But again, that was because there were like 3 hectares or whatever it was back in 2008. Okay, let's move on. So those are the ones that have increased by more than 100% in those years. So a bit of Sauvignon, not a vast amount, but a bit of Sauvignon. Right, so that's the data part of the presentation. And I've rushed through it a bit because time is a bit short, but that's fine. Now we're going to consider in a little bit more detail 6 top grape varieties, which I think are of real interest to international audiences. And if you are a wine writer, well, obviously you are all wine writers, or a buyer of wine, these are varieties which are well worth knowing about and even better drinking. So the first of these is Arneis, which, as you will know, had a real revival in the late 80s and 1990s, and then, as we've seen, has had a terrific increase in this century. It's a variety of unknown parentage, but it is strongly associated with the Roero regions. I mean, as far as we know, it is from Roero. That's the straightforward way of putting it. And the name itself may well come from the vineyard you can see in the picture, which is called Renesio. And you can hear that Arneis and Renesio are not that different in terms of sounds. And interestingly, that we have a very early documentation for this vineyard, was cited in 1478 as an important vineyard way back then, which is fantastic. Obviously, we don't know exactly what was in the vineyard then, but the fact that it was still known then is remarkable. Anise historically was problematic because it oxidizes very easily in the winery, and therefore in the past it would have been often more brown or amber, and often sweet before its modern incarnation, and working reductively, i.e. excluding oxygen from the production, has been the key to its modern success. What does it taste like? So it's a delicate aromatically, it's a delicate grape variety. Most of these are, but it has these lovely lemon, green herb characteristics, and it has a saline finish. It's very, very unusual in the Italian white wine scene in that it's only moderately acidic. It's the least acidic of all the grape varieties I'm going to talk about today. And in general, it stands out for its moderate acidity. And it's medium bodied, so it's not super light bodied. It's actually, I mean, the best examples can be actually a bit more than medium bodied. But above all, it's very approachable and versatile. You can drink it with pretty much, many foods or on its own. So I think that's part of its success as a grape variety. And then if we go to a particular example of it, this wine actually, since I made this nothing to do with my presentation. Since I made this presentation at Vinitaly last year, this wine has won Wine of the Year from Gambaro Rosso this year, which is fantastic, from the Roero producer Monchiara Carbone, Roero DOCG Reserva, Renesio Incisa. So this is actually from the Renesio vineyard. And it's grown on clay and sand soils, which is a little bit unusual in Roero. In fact, if you talk to Francesco Monchiero, the winemaker, he will say, actually, this vineyard could be a Nebbiolo vineyard because there is enough clay. Because, as you know, Roero is super sandy, and 60, 70% sand is not uncommon. And Arnay seems to do really well on that. However, on this slightly richer soil, it does produce a wine with more body, and probably more lasting power as well. And yeah, soils at 250 meters, pretty standard for Roero, and southeast facing. So this is a prime site given over to this important Arnase. How's it made? Fruit protected with nitrogen in the press, as I was saying, inoculated as fermentation takes place at 14 centigrade. So you don't go for really super cool fermentation temperatures with Arnase, because you don't really want those estery flavors which fade quickly, particularly not in a wine that you could keep for some years. And the interesting thing about this one, this is very unusual. So this wine is aged for 7 to 9 months in a mix of second and third use French oak and acacia barrique and Austrian oak cask. So there's like 1/3 in French oak, 1/3 in acacia, 1/3 in Austrian oak cask with occasional batonnage. And then before release, kept for 4 years in the bottle. So clearly, this is a wine which is made, unlike most Arnase, for immediate consumption, which would be aged briefly in stainless steel, perhaps for up to a year for a premium example. This one is aged for 5 years before it is released. So this is an example of the top quality that you can wine, which you can make with the Arnase grape variety. So I hope that's whetted your appetite for top quality Arnase. Okay, moving on. Let's go to Moscato Bianco. So all the wines in this presentation I'm going to be talking about are still wines. So you might wonder why I've put Moscato in here. And there is a reason for that. But Moscato is so fundamental to the Piedmontese wine scene. I really wanted to include Moscato in this presentation. And interestingly, it also has a long history. There's a statute in La Mora in Barolo of 1511, which requires new vineyards to be at least 20% Moscato. If you planted Moscato in La Mora today, you'd probably be, chucked out of you'd be beaten out of the region, because after all, nobody plants anything except Nebbiolo in La Mora these days. But it's really interesting that it was already prized and protected back there in the 16th century. As you all know, at least 90% of all Moscato in Piemonte goes into Asti or into Moscato d'Asti, so into semi-sparkling or sparkling wine, typically made with the tank method for immediate consumption. But the best are ageable. And the reason I put this particular picture on this slide was this was a tasting I did in 2022 with a winery called Cascina Cerruti, and he introduced me to this. He put on this little mini vertical for me from the current vintage back to, and the wine you're looking at in the glass is 2014, tasted in 2022. So this is Moscato d'Asti of that age, and it really, at this quality level, it really ages well. Of course, it loses some of the immediate freshness of classic Moscato d'Asti, but it develops all these amazing herbal, rosemary, lavender notes. It's really beautiful wine, and really interesting that we don't think of the Moscato as aging, or Moscato d'Asti as aging, but it does. And that was one of the impetuses, if that's a word, for the new Canelli DOCG. So Canelli used to be a subzone of Moscato d'Asti, and it has now become a DOCG in its own right. So it's become a denomination in its own right. And that's partly so that the wines from the heart of the denomination, the three most important Moscato towns, of which Canelli is the best known, have their own denomination. So it's partly about terroir, but it's also because they introduced a Reserva category. So there's Canelli DOCG Reserva, and that requires a minimum of 30 months of aging before release. Now, if you just stop to think about it, that's crazy because you can drink Moscato d'Asti is the first wine you can drink after the vintage in Piemonte. You can drink it in October or early November of the year of harvest. And of course, much of it is made for Christmas of the year of harvest. But this one has to be aged for 30 months. So there again, they're really going to give a push to Moscato d'Asti or Canelli DOCG Reserva with proper aging. What about still Moscato? So the challenge for making still Moscato is twofold. One is bitterness because it's if you don't do it well, it can be bitter because of the skins. And secondly, it can be overly aromatic. Sometimes when you put a glass of dry Muscat in front of people, they just pull away from it because they just don't want that intensity of aromatics. So how does one deal with that? I'll just give you one example. So there's a very small group of producers who are championing Moscato Secco, so dry Moscato, one of which is Emanuele Gambino, who produces this Mofrem bottling. So Mofrem is simply Moscato Frem, so in Piedmontese dialect, dry Moscato. And he deals with it, first of all, by whole bunch press, so very gentle pressing, not to extract too much of the bitterness from the skins. He blocks the MLF, which is unusual because on the whole you try to hang on to all the acidity in Moscato, and then he ages it for 3 to 5 months in amphora, so a neutral but mildly oxidative environment, and that no doubt tones down the immediate aromatics of dry Moscato. So I think this is an interesting trend, and I think we'll see more younger producers putting dry Moscato on the market. Okay, so that's a little look at Moscato Bianco. Moving on to Timorasso. Most of you will know that this variety was rescued from total obscurity. It was down to 3 hectares in 1980. It has a great history. It's probably mentioned back in 1304, which is amazing. And you can see why it dropped out of cultivation because it's difficult. It's vigorous, so it needs lots of canopy management, but it produces low yields. It's prone to grey rot. It has small berries with high sugar levels, and it doesn't ripen evenly. So it's a very difficult grape variety. It was revived by Walter Massa from 1987, and he also created the standard modern way of producing it. So 2 to 3 days of skin contact. So it's had a little bit of tannin, which is in line with the full bodiedness of Timorasso. He ferments it at 18 centigrade. He typically he loves to be provocative. He says, "I'm not interested in primary aromas." So hence the warm fermentation. Puts it through MLF, keeps it on lees for a year. And he tells the story that when he made his first batch in 1987 from 300 vines, he made the wine, put it in the back of the cellar, forgot it, and 4 years later came across it and discovered how amazingly Timorasso develops in the bottle. So as a young wine, it's pretty neutral, but as it ages, so from 4 to 5 years onwards, you get these remarkable Riesling-like petrol, smoke, dried stone fruit, almond, honey notes. So that's really the thing that really marks out Timorasso from many. There's going to be a new denomination for it, but I think we'll skip that. And then the one example I have here is Origo, which is the best wine made by Vigneti Rapetto from two of the best plots planted in 1992. So decent vine age, and then again 3 years of aging before it's put on the market. Okay, so much for the super fashionable Timoras. Let's move on to Erbeluce. It's an appropriate place because I'm talking from Gattinara in northern Piemonte, where they grow it, where their white wines are Erbeluce, though it's more famous in the Caluso area to the west of here. So again, variety of unknown parentage, strongly associated with the Caluso area, mentioned by Giovanni Battista Croce in 1606. Some wonderful stories about him, but I haven't got time for those. You'll have to read them in my book about the wines of Piemonte. There you go, a little plug. Erbeluce is mostly grown on pergola, which is interesting, on poor, sandy, and pebbly soils. Pergola, of course, you have to work it all by hand, which is a real problem, but the shading seems to help, particularly as Erbeluce is very versatile in that you can make three styles of wine from it. I'm just going to skip to the next section. So you can make the standard still wine, which is what most of it is, and you do that with conventional modern winemaking, no MLF, and a few wines aged in neutral oak or terracotta. And you come out with something very lean, acidic, but with remarkable aging potential. Or you can make, because it's neutral aromatically and high acidity, you can make fantastic traditional method sparkling wine. If you ever get the chance to taste Erbeluce, traditional method, it's really worth it. And then equally, it makes fantastic sweet passito wines. So you can see in the picture, the grapes being dried inside for a passito style wine. Again, because of the high acidity, and you will find remarkable, I mean, you can buy bottles that are 10 to 15-year-olds for almost nothing in Piemonte of this wine. Because sadly, as we all know, it's difficult to sell sweet wine, but this is a real treasure. So if we move on, so what is Erbeluce like? Gentle, floral, lemon, green apple notes, and this high acidity, which I've mentioned already. And then just to give you one example, this is an example of the traditional method one, which I was speaking so warmly about. So this is from the winery called Czech. So Remo Falconeri was a typewriter designer at Olivetti, which is a major industry in northern Piemonte. And he is the pioneer of traditional method Erbeluce. And he was inspired by wood-aged champagne. So this wine, 1/3 of the must is fermented in barrique. And then when the whole lot is put together, it's aged for 4 years on the lees in the bottle. And it's extra root in style. It's a really interesting, complex, beautiful traditional method sparkling wine. Okay, so much for Erbeluce in northern Piemonte. Okay, let's move on. Quick look at the time. Yep. Okay, Nascetta. So this is an interesting grape variety in that it is a one-town native. So basically, we all associate grape varieties with particular regions or even countries. Nascetta actually is from one village, the village of Novello, which is one of the 11 Barolo villages. And it again fell into disrepute and was only registered. In other words, you're only allowed to put it formally in wine from 2001. And again, the reason is that it's very difficult to grow. It has this. It grows at like 45 degrees. It doesn't have a very strong upright habit, and therefore you have to do a lot of canopy management. And then it has very variable yield, both through millirondage, but also just from year to year. You don't know how much you're going to get. And it has tight bunches, as you can see in the picture, and therefore is a bit prone to disease. And finally, you have to pick it at exactly the right time because it drops acidity very quickly at maturity. And therefore, you can see why, if you are a peasant farmer and you're going to grow either Nascetta or Barbera, you're going to grow Barbera every day of the week because it's going to be reliable, and you're not going to have all these problems. So Nascetta has some visibility that's but that's principally because it's grown within the Barolo region. Okay, so when you go and visit somebody in Novello, they'll say, "Do you want to taste my white wine?" And they will show you their Nascetta, which is a beautiful, great variety. But interestingly, it hasn't really traveled. It's only gone from 6 to 66 hectares. I mean, okay, that is tenfold, but even so, it hasn't really traveled anywhere else in the Barolo region or even or beyond in Piemonte. But the prime reason for its not growing very much is that unlike Timorasso, where there's lots of land available in the Colli Tortonesi, of course, it is competing directly with land for Nebbiolo in Barolo. And for most of the time, there's only going to be one winner there. Conventional modern white winemaking. And then it has this lovely, precise citrus blossom, apricot aromas, medium bodied, lively acidity despite a moderate pH. And mostly people block the MLF to retain that acidity. And then the example I'm giving you is Le Strette. So the most famous example is Elvio Cogno, but this Le Strette was equally a pioneer with Cogno. The two have documentation from exactly the same period. So I thought it's nice to show Le Strette instead for a change. And this particular bottling is from 4 vineyards. They do a very unusual single vineyard Nascetta called Passinot, which is also worth looking out for. But and that one comes from the older vineyards, the 1948 vineyards. Final lovely point on the point of law. So if you are in the village of Novello, you are allowed to call your wine and spell it Nascetta, like you see on the screen, del Comune di Novello. So that's the difference between it and Langa Nebbiolo generic. We love a bit of complication in Italian wine law. How does Le Stretta make it? 4 days of Crio, fermented at 18 centigrade, full MLF, aged on lees for 9 months, and with batonnage for the first 6 months. Okay, moving on. So if Nascetta is rare, this is absolutely tiny. Rossese Bianco, lovely grape variety. It's actually Ligurian in origin, arrived in Barolo area 200 years ago on the trade route and revived in Monforte d'Alba. So again, you're actually within Barolo area from 1980. Has gone from 1 hectare to a massive 7 hectares only. This year is going to see the 6th producer produce their wine, so it's small. Again, not a reliable yielder. Citrus and herbal and sapid. And this Manzoni Giovanni were the pioneers of this, and they make theirs with 7 to 8 hours of skin contact and then aged for 11 months in 500-litre old barrels with monthly batonnage. Okay, one for the real wine geeks among you. That's all of you, of course. Iosetta Safirio does the same, similar grape variety, but uses some botrytized fruit. So there's a little bit of variation. So we come to an end, folks. White wine is a major trend in Piemonte. It's now 40% of all plantings, and that shows no sign of abating. The most important thing is that Piemonte produces highly characterful, distinctive white wines to complement the region's great red wines. When I do wine tourism for groups in Piemonte, it's really easy to choose wines for meals because you've got this huge range of white wine plus sparkling plus the great reds. That's quite atypical for much of Italy. The real focus should be on the native varieties, Arnese, Cortese, Erbolucci, Nascetta, Timorasso, in my opinion. And we might see some more Rossese Bianco, and then also Barocciuccat. This is lovely. Barocciuccat is also a tiny, tiny trend, and we'll see whether it grows further in the future. So we come to the end of the presentation. Back to you, Meg. Oh, I'm just going to put up my last slide just to show you the book, which you can buy online. And also, if anyone reads Italian naturally, I have the amazing honor of it being translated into Italian and which will arrive when it says this autumn, actually it means this spring. And it'll be presented at Vinitaly this year, which is, yeah, amazing. Okay, over to you, Meg.
That's fantastic. Also, I should note that the Wines of Piemonte is available as an ebook, which is what I have.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I would have brandished it in my introduction.
yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you, David. That was really, truly excellent. There was some chat going on. I think before we get to one or two questions from one participant, I wanted to ask a clarifying question about the Moscato Canelli DOCG. Is that with the 30 months of aging? Is that a tank method wine? Is it with
Yes,
autoclave or it is?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Typically tank method. Yes,
Are they
absolutely.
holding it
There
in
are a few.
tank for 30 months or are they holding it in bottle? Like how does that break out?
It'll be in bottle.
In
It'll
a
be.
bottle.
My understanding is that majority of people make it, bottle it, and then age in bottle. Yeah,
I see. I see.
yeah.
And yeah, that's fascinating. Wait, what is it like? Have you tried them? Do they?
I mean, it's very like the best Moscato d'Asti because that's what it is. Let's be
Yeah,
honest. Because basically they have taken a chunk out the historic area for Moscato, the most prized area, Canelli, Santo Stefano Belbo, those villages, basically, and put a line around them. So it tastes just like it's no different in that sense from the Moscato from the very top producers
mhm,
in the past. The difference is that now you can produce a standard Canelli DOCG, so it can be young wine, or you can have a reserva, so you
mhm,
have something to talk about and to explain what's different about this wine. It's a minimum of 30 months of aging. Yeah.
mhm. Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. So Patricia had a couple of questions. First question was about how the vineyards are getting cut over, whether they're being grafted over or ripped and replanted. And then she had a second question about the clays that are being used, the source of the clays being used for um, making these aging or fermentation and aging vessels. So Patricia, do
Okay.
you want to unmute and clarify? I don't know if I did justice to your question.
I can try, although I probably being slightly overwhelmed by my current air fryer. Um, Sorry about that, but it's coming up for late here. Um, yeah, I don't. My question really about the way the change in the grape varieties, David, is being done. Are they budding over? Or are they actually grubbing up and
Yeah.
then replanting?
Yeah. Basically the latter. Yeah. I haven't heard anybody talking about top grafting. Um, and that's partly because um, if you don't have a market for your dolcetto, or if your Barbera is getting very ill, then you're going to dig it up and start, and then plant something different. And you remember that particularly in the Langhe, those two would be in the less favorable sites because the Nebbiolo would be in the best sites, and therefore they would be highly suitable for white grapes. They'll be on a cooler slope already. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I
Second,
don't can't yeah, I can't throw any light on the second question. I have no idea what people are doing. I guess they're probably all doing different things. It's not really a huge thing. It's just how winemakers love to play. Well, I mean they'll make their main bottlings and then they'll have a little corner where they have a couple of something in a different container of some sort. Somebody will have ceramic, somebody else will have, whatever. It's not really a major. Piemonte is quite a traditional area. There's not a huge amount. There's so much decent demand for their wines anyway, that they don't really need to experiment. It's more, as I say, winemakers having fun.
that's really helpful, actually, David. And believe me, I do know about it. I did have a little bit of a follow up question, though, and you might know a little bit more about it. If they're grubbing up their vineyards to replant, what
Mhm.
rootstocks are they replanting with?
I haven't really followed that up, to be honest. I
Okay,
couldn't. Yeah.
fair enough. Thanks.
Okay, that's a pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. I don't see any other questions unless I've missed something. If I have missed something, please feel free to unmute or just drop something here in the chat so that we can have you come forward. I found it really fascinating to see the first trends in what's being planted and what's not being planted. And I think that the increase in interest in white wines is mirroring what's happening in a lot of other wine regions as well, as the appetite for white wines is increased. Are you seeing that in the markets? Are producers actively trying to tap into those trends? I mean, as you mentioned, it takes a while for a vineyard to become productive.
I don't get the impression that people say, "Oh, by the way, have you noticed that people are drinking?" I'm sure locally they notice what they're selling. Um, I think it's more about, yeah. So I don't think it's a conscious response to a worldwide trend. I think it's more about what do you do, what is selling locally. Because remember things like the aperitivo hour the aperitivo hour has become really, really important because people don't have them. Since the financial crisis, people have had less money to go out and spend, and therefore the Piedmontese and Italians have invented this thing called apericena, which is a sort of halfway between an aperitivo and a meal. So you go and pay your 15 euros flat rate, and you get a couple of drinks and a plate of snacks and bits of pizza and whatnot. Many people are going to, in that situation, are going to choose white wine or rosé, not red. And so the demand for white wine locally is greater, I think. And then also this question about, I mean, Dolcetto has become really difficult to sell. I think it's a great shame. I think it's actually a very, very interesting grape variety, but people don't understand it. And it's in real crisis. And then, yeah, Barbera has this problem with disease. So I think part of it is simply people replacing vineyards that need to be replaced for other reasons. Part of it is following a local market, and part of it, and then of course we didn't have time to talk about it, but the if you have a site which is good enough for Nebbiolo, everyone plants Nebbiolo. You will see a couple of years ago they in Monferrato, not in the Langhe, so in central Piemonte, they changed the law so that Monferrato DOC can now be Monferrato DOC Nebbiolo. And you're going to see a lot of that in the future because it used to have to just be Monferrato Rosso and you didn't know it was Nebbiolo. Now you can actually name it as Nebbiolo. And people are that part of the don't think that all the planting of Nebbiolo that we saw on that graph was in the Langhe. It isn't because the Langhe is pretty much fully planted. People are planting Nebbiolo in all sorts of other places because it is such a valuable commodity. The wines are of a decent quality. I wouldn't say that I haven't really tasted a great Monferrato Nebbiolo. I'm later this year. I'm going to the place where somebody won a tre bicchieri, so 3 glasses from Gambaro Rosso for their Nebbiolo from Monferrato. So that'll be really interesting to see whether how good that is. Most of them are like a decent Langhe Nebbiolo. Yeah.
Very fascinating. Thank you. And you made me wonder about whether anyone is making a white wine from Nebbiolo grapes. I mean, there is some sparkling. I know Blanc de Noir
Yeah.
sparkling that's happening there, traditional method. But is anyone making like a white Nebbiolo?
Yes, but it's absolutely minuscule.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for the same reason, you can sell your Nebbiolo. Selling your Nebbiolo is not a problem.
Mhm.
It's selling your Barbera and your Dolcetto and whatever else you've got. That's the issue. So the commercial imperative to make white Nebbiolo is zero, basically.
Yeah,
So it's just
understood.
again, it's just the odd wine, odd is the wrong word, the unusual winemaker who wants to do something different, who's going to make a white Nebbiolo. Yeah, a bit like white Sangiovese in Tuscany, same
Yeah,
phenomenon.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
And are these white wines generally are they varietally named on the label? Are they announcing the name? Are they trying to sort of raise awareness? How are they going to market with these?
All of those, with one exception, are marketed varietally. Okay, so I mean that's one of the things about about Piemonte as a whole is that most of the wine is varietal.
Hmm.
There are
Yeah.
two important exceptions. One is where I'm talking to you from. So Alto Piemonte has a tradition of blending Nebbiolo with other grape varieties, local grape varieties, Vespolina, Croatina, Uvarara. That's unusual. And also unusual, and I have no idea about I don't understand the law here, because every producer will tell you here that they can't write Erbaluce, they're not allowed to write Erbaluce on the label, which I think is completely mad, because how can you protect people? How can you stop people writing a great, Sangiovese di Romagna doesn't stop anybody writing Sangiovese anywhere else in Tuscany.
Mhm.
Whereas here they genuinely believe that they're not allowed to write. Clearly they went through some sort of process. When Caluso became a DOCG, it's called Erbaluce di Caluso,
Mhm.
and they came to some agreement or something happened, and they believe that they're not allowed to write. So here it just has to be called Vino Bianco,
Oh, geez.
or some other name. But that's the only exception. Elsewhere, everyone has got the grape variety on. So Roero Arnese
Yeah.
has got the grape
Yes,
variety,
of course,
hasn't it,
right,
on it?
right.
Yeah.
Which is really what we
Timorasso,
see in the States is what we see our nace. We don't see very many. We don't see varietal Cortese. We don't
no.
see,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's interesting. So Gavi is it could be called Cortese di Gavi, but it isn't. It's called
it
Gavi.
isn't. It's called agave, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so you're not seeing really. These sound like very characterful grapes. So
Mhm.
we're not getting anything really from blending them necessarily, right? I mean, there's not really a blending tradition with the white grapes, it sounds like.
That's correct. And the blend, where there are blends, they tend to be blends of international varieties.
Right.
People will blend, Chardonnay with a bit of Viognier or something of that sort, a bit of Sauvignon or whatever.
Mhm.
And those tend to be Langhe Bianco, Monferrato Bianco, Piemonte Bianco.
Mhm.
But you don't really blend. I mean, there will be some examples somewhere doing something strange, but typically they are the overwhelming tradition here is single grape varietal
Mhm.
wines. Yeah.
Mhm. So if a producer who needed to rip out 8 hectares asked your personal opinion about what they should plant, I mean, granted, there's some territory differences, right? So there's sand or clay or what have you. What advice would you give them based on what you're seeing and tasting and seeing in the market as well?
I think that would mainly depend on where they were, because
Yeah.
I do think they should go with the great variety that has been proven to be good. It's
Mhm.
really interesting, for example, that all the Barolo and Barbaresca producers, and quite a lot of them, have gone to the trouble of buying land an hour and a half away in the Colli
Mhm.
Tortonesi, because that's where Timorasso does well. Now, we don't really know whether it would do well elsewhere.
Mhm.
I've tasted one example from somewhere else and it was okay. It wasn't great, but it wasn't, you need more than one example to know whether it's going to grow well in Monferrato. So I think basically people should probably continue to stick with what works locally. It's also a
Mhm.
massive issue about I mean, the problem is the complexity, isn't it? That there are so many denominations, so many great varieties.
Yeah.
If you introduce further complication by saying, "Oh, I'm going to grow my Timorasso in, wherever," and then I'm going to have to label it something generic because
Yes.
nobody's heard of
Right.
Timorasso around here, so it's going to be Monferrato Bianco or whatever. So I would go with the local, and above all, I would go with the native grape variety. That's it seems to me
Yeah.
that in the international market in particular, of course, you grow Chardonnay here reasonably successfully, but it's only drunk in Italy and in Piemonte, with a couple of Aldo Conterno's Bucidor. Okay, fine, but that's sold because it's Aldo Conterno, not because it's
Right.
Chardonnay grown
Right.
in grown in Monforte. So I really believe in these grape varieties because they are distinctive and they do come from particular places. So yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. That is a perfect way to wrap up, I think. I'm with you on believing in the native grapes. So thank you very much, David. That was fascinating. And for everyone who maybe missed a portion, or if you'd like to share this, this will be online on our YouTube channel later on once we've done the editing of the tops and tails. And so thank you again. I'll hand it back to Andrea to sign off.
I'm just going to say thank you to everybody for listening in, and I hope it was interesting. And if you want to know more, do email me. Yeah, great.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much, David. A very enlightening presentation. Yes, superb.